After his grandfather disappeared and the state took over, a 16-year-old boy was given a choice: another group home or the streets. He chose a third option. What he found on a forgotten piece of land would not only teach him how to survive a brutal winter, but reveal a truth that would change his life forever. If you've ever felt lost or abandoned, this story is for you. Stick with me, and if you feel a connection, consider subscribing. We talk about real things here. The air in Ms. Albright's office was the color of weak tea and smelled like stale paper and quiet desperation. It was the same air I'd been breathing in different state-run rooms for the past 2 years, ever since my world had shrunk to the size of a backpack and a case file. Today was different, though. Today the air had an edge of finality to it. It was my 16th birthday, a day that for most kids meant cake and maybe the keys to a car. For me, it meant I was an administrative problem that had just expired. Ms. Albright folded her hands on the faux wood grain of her desk. The gesture was meant to be calming, I think, but it just made her look like she was bracing for impact. "So, Leo," she began, her voice a carefully modulated blend of sympathy and bureaucratic fatigue. "As we've discussed, your 16th birthday changes your legal status. You're no longer a minor under the direct mandate of Child Protective Services. You're in a transitional category." Transitional. I'd been in a transitional category my whole life. Transitioning from having parents to not having them. Transitioning from living with my grandpa to watching him walk out of my life with nothing but a note. Transitioning from a home to a series of houses filled with other transitional kids. I was an expert in transitioning. It was the arriving that I'd never mastered. "What that means practically," she continued, pulling a thin folder toward her, "is that we have 2 paths forward." She slid a glossy brochure across the desk. It showed smiling multi-ethnic teens playing basketball in front of a sterile brick building. Path 1 is the Northgate Transitional Living Program. It's a group home environment, but with more independence. You'll have a roommate, chores, a curfew. You'll be required to either finish your GED or find employment. It's structured. It's safe. I looked at the picture. The smiles looked painted on. The basketball was frozen in the air, a perfect orange sphere of corporate hope. It looked exactly like the last place and the one before that. Structured, safe. The words felt like lead weights. It was a cage, just one with a slightly longer chain. "And path 2?" I asked. My voice came out as a croak. I cleared my throat and tried again, aiming for a tone that sounded less like a cornered animal. "What's path 2? Ms. Albright's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, I saw the woman, not the social worker. I saw someone who was tired of presenting children with terrible options. She sighed, a small puff of air that barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light. "Path 2 is you sign the emancipation papers. We give you your final stipend check from the state's trust fund for your care. It's not much, Leo. It's the remainder of what was allocated. Enough for a month's rent on a cheap room, maybe. After that, you're on your own. You'd be a legal adult for all intents and purposes, free to make your own choices." Free. The word hung in the stale air between us. Freedom to what? To starve? To freeze? It was the freedom of being thrown from a boat in the middle of the ocean. The brochure for the group home suddenly seemed less like a cage and more like a life raft, however flimsy. I didn't say anything. I just stared at the worn spot on the carpet next to my foot. My mind was a blank, a staticky television screen. Fear was a cold, heavy thing in the pit of my stomach. too big to even properly feel. It was just a dense, physical presence. "Leo?" Ms. Albright prompted gently. "I need an answer. There's a waiting list for Northgate." My hand went unconsciously to the backpack at my feet. Inside, wrapped in an old sock, was a small cardboard box. And inside that box was a single, heavy, rust-pitted key. It was the only thing I had left of my grandpa, the only thing I'd made sure to grab in the chaotic hours after I'd found his note and the men in uniforms had come to my house. The key didn't fit any door I knew. It was for a gate, he'd told me once, long ago. A gate to a place out in the middle of nowhere. A place with a funny metal building, shaped like half a pipe, that he called the Quonset. The memory was faint, like a dream from childhood. Running through tall grass, the metallic echo of my laughter inside that cavernous space. The smell of sun-baked dust and old machinery. My grandpa, tall and solid, telling me, "This is our backup, Leo, our fortress of solitude. If the world ever goes sideways, this is where we retreat." The world had gone sideways. He had retreated, but he'd left me behind. The thought was a familiar pang, a wound I'd poked and prodded for 2 years until it was raw and permanently inflamed. He left me. He wrote, "I'm sorry," on a greasy napkin and vanished, leaving a 16-year-old grandson to be swallowed by the system he'd always taught me to distrust. But he'd also left me the key. "I'll take path 2, I heard myself say. The words came from somewhere deep inside, a place that wasn't numb, a place that still had a flicker of something. Defiance, maybe. Or just desperation. Ms. Albright's carefully constructed composure cracked. "Leo, think about this. You have no family, no support system. It's October. It's going to get cold. Where will you go?" The question was practical, sensible. I didn't have a practical, sensible answer. I had a half-forgotten memory and a rusty key. "I have a place," I said, the lie tasting strange and unfamiliar in my mouth. It wasn't entirely a lie, though. It was a hope, a ghost of a plan. And it was mine. She argued for another 10 minutes, laying out the grim realities of teen homelessness with practiced precision. I listened, I nodded, but my mind was already gone. It was on a bus, heading north. It was walking down a gravel road. It was standing in front of a rusted gate, holding a key that might not even work anymore. Finally, she gave up. With another sigh, one that held the weight of hundreds of kids she couldn't save, she pushed a stack of papers toward me. "Sign here, here, and here." I signed my name, my hand surprisingly steady. With each signature, I felt a cord being cut, the last thin threads connecting me to any kind of official safety net. When I was done, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a check. $753, the cash value of the state's responsibility for me. "Good luck, Leo," she said, and for the first time, her voice was just a voice. Not a social worker, not a bureaucrat, just a person watching another person walk toward a cliff. "I mean it." "Thanks," I mumbled, shouldering my backpack. The weight of it felt different now. It was all I had. The key inside seemed heavier than ever. I walked out of the office, down the long, linoleum-tiled hallway, and pushed open the heavy glass doors of the Department of Family Services. The city air hit me like a slap. It was cold, damp, and smelled of exhaust fumes and rain. It was the smell of Path 2, the smell of freedom. And I had never been more terrified in my entire life. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, watching the traffic flow by. A river of people, all going somewhere. I had $700, a backpack with 3 shirts and 2 pairs of jeans, and a key to a memory. I was 16 years old, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The first stop was the bank, where I turned the state's check into a small, precious wad of cash. Holding it in my pocket, a lump of dense paper, felt more real than any promise a social worker could make. It was finite. It was mine. The next stop was a discount Army-Navy surplus store. I walked the aisles under the dim fluorescent lights, my mind a frantic calculator. What does a person need to not die? The list was terrifyingly long. I bought a better sleeping bag, one rated to 0 degrees. It was a lie. They were all lies. But 0 sounded better than the 32-degree rating on the cheap one I'd had for years. I bought a small, single-burner propane stove and 4 green canisters of fuel. A metal pot. A fork, a spoon, a knife. A flint and steel, because Grandpa always said 2 is 1 and 1 is none, and lighters fail. I bought the thickest wool socks they had, 3 pairs. A wool watch cap. Gloves. A heavy-duty tarp. The pile on the counter grew, and the wad of cash in my pocket shrank. The man at the register was old, with a face like a worn leather boot. He rang up my items without a word, his eyes flicking from my thin frame to the serious survival gear. He probably saw kids like me all the time, runaways playing at being mountain men. "That'll be $286, he grunted. I counted out the bills. As he bagged everything, he paused, holding up the flint and steel. "You know how to use this?" I nodded. "Yeah, my grandpa taught me." He grunted again. It might have been a sign of approval. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small, foil-wrapped brick. "Here," he said, tossing it in the bag. "Magnesium bar. Shave a little off with your knife. Catches a spark, even when things are damp." "How much?" I asked, reaching for my wallet. He waved a dismissive hand. "On the house. Kid who buys a flint and steel instead of a pack of Bics deserves a break." He looked me in the eye for a second. "Good luck out there. Winter's coming early this year." The small act of kindness almost broke me. I mumbled my thanks and hurried out, the bell on the door jingling behind me. Winter's coming early. The words echoed in my head. I had just under $500 left. The bus station was next. The woman behind the thick glass looked as bored as a human could be. "Where to?" she asked, chewing her gum with a rhythmic snap. I hesitated. I knew the name of the town, a little dot on a map near the Canadian border. A place called Northwood. I'd only seen it on a map his grandpa had, a circle drawn around it in red pen. "A ticket to Northwood," I said. She typed for a moment, her long fingernails clicking on the keyboard. "One way or round trip?" "One way." Another click. "Northwood bus runs once a day, leaves at 6 p.m., gets in tomorrow morning around 8 a.m. It's a milk run, stops everywhere. That'll be $82. I paid and took the ticket. The flimsy piece of paper felt like a judgment. I had a destination now, a name for my foolish hope. For the next few hours I wandered the city. I didn't want to sit in the grimy bus station, a place that seemed to suck the hope out of the air. I walked through parks where leaves, brittle and brown, skittered across the pavement. I watched families, laughing, warm in their coats. Every happy person I saw was like a small twist of a knife. The world was full of belonging, and I was on the outside of all of it, a ghost looking through a window. The story I told myself was simple. My grandpa got tired of me. He got tired of the responsibility, of the ghost of my parents hanging over our house. He found a new life, a new start, and I wasn't part of the plan. 2 years in the system had hardened this story into fact. It was easier to be angry than to be heartbroken. Anger was a shield. It kept the cold out, or so I thought. As the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows from the buildings, I finally made my way to the station. I bought a greasy burger and a coffee from the snack bar and found a seat in the waiting area. The money was a constant, nagging worry. I had spent nearly half of it, and I hadn't even arrived. What if the hut was gone? What if someone else lived there? What if it was just a pile of rust? My brain supplied 100 catastrophic possibilities, but underneath the fear, that tiny, stubborn flicker of defiance remained. This was my choice. Good or bad, it was mine. When they finally called my bus, I joined the shuffling line of passengers. We were a collection of the weary, the lonely, the people moving from one place to another without much joy in the journey. I found a seat by a window, stuffed my new gear under my feet, and pressed my forehead against the cool glass. The bus pulled out of the station with a hydraulic hiss, a great lumbering beast joining the river of red taillights heading out of the city. I watched the familiar skyline shrink, the tall buildings that had been the backdrop to my life dissolving into the deepening twilight. The city lights gave way to the scattered lights of the suburbs, and then those too thinned out, replaced by long stretches of profound, inky blackness. The journey was a blur of darkness and intermittent light. We passed through sleeping towns, their main streets lit by a single, lonely traffic light blinking yellow into the empty intersection. At each stop, a few people would get on or off, their faces briefly illuminated in the bus's interior lights before they were swallowed by the night. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind was a loop of my grandpa's face, Ms. Albright's warnings, and the ever-dwindling number in my head, $400 and some odd. I watched the landscape change through the dirty window. The flat plains of the south gave way to rolling hills, then to dense forests of pine and birch. The air, even inside the bus, seemed to get colder, cleaner. I saw the moon, a perfect white disk in a sky sprayed with an impossible number of stars. Out here, away from the city's glow, the universe felt vast and indifferent. It didn't care about a 16-year-old boy on a bus. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. My problems were my own, but they were also small. Sometime before dawn, I must have drifted off, because I was startled awake by the bus driver's voice crackling over the intercom. Next stop, Northwood, Crossroads Station, 10 minutes. I sat up, my heart pounding. My breath fogged the window. I wiped it clear with my sleeve and peered out. The world was shades of gray and deep blue, the first hints of dawn painting the eastern sky. We were on a 2-lane highway flanked by thick, dark woods. Snow dusted the shoulders of the road and clung to the branches of the pines. It was real. The cold was real. The bus slowed, its turn signal clicking rhythmically, and pulled into a gravel lot next to a single building. It was a gas station with a small, attached convenience store. A sign on a pole read, "Northwood," in peeling red letters. This was it. This was the dot on the map. The bus doors hissed open, letting in a blast of frigid air that felt like a physical blow. "Northwood," the driver called out, not looking back. I grabbed my backpack and my new gear and stumbled down the aisle, the only one getting off. I stepped down onto the gravel, and the bus pulled away almost immediately, its red taillights disappearing around a bend, leaving me in a sudden, shocking silence. The only sounds were the hum of the drink cooler inside the gas station, and the whisper of the wind through the pines. The sun was still below the horizon, but the sky was lightening, turning a soft, bruised purple. It was colder than I could have ever imagined. The cold didn't just touch my skin, it seemed to sink right into my bones. I looked around. There was the gas station, the highway stretching in two directions, and a smaller gravel road leading off into the woods, marked by a faded wooden sign. According to my grandpa's old map, which I had memorized like a prayer, that was the road I needed. Hemlock Lane. It was 3 miles down that road. 3 miles. It didn't sound far, but in this cold, with the weight on my back, it felt like a journey to the moon. I shifted the straps of my backpack, pulled my new wool hat down over my ears, and started walking. The gravel crunched under my boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The world was waking up. A few birds called out from the woods. The sky slowly brightened from purple to pink to a pale, watery orange. But the rising sun brought no warmth. The air was sharp and clean and carried the scent of pine and snow and damp earth. It was the smell of the north. With every step, the fear and the hope warred inside me. This was the most foolish thing I had ever done. This was the only thing I could have done. The two thoughts weren't contradictory. They were two sides of the same desperate coin. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. Up ahead, half swallowed by overgrown bushes, was a gate. A rusted, chain-link gate strung between two tilting wooden posts. A barely legible sign, nailed to one of the posts, read, "Trespassing, K. Henderson," my grandpa's initial. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped my gear and fumbled in my backpack, my fingers numb and clumsy in the cold. I pulled out the old sock, unwrapped it, and took out the key. It felt like a relic in my palm, ancient and important. I walked to the gate. A heavy chain was wrapped around the posts, held together by a massive, rust-encrusted padlock. It looked like it hadn't been opened in a decade. I took a deep breath, the icy air stinging my lungs, and slid the key into the lock. For a moment, it wouldn't go. My heart sank. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in my throat. I jiggled it, pushed harder. Then, with a grating screech, it slid all the way in. I held my breath and turned. The lock resisted, groaned, and then, with a loud, definitive click, it sprang open. I almost wept with relief. I unwound the heavy chain, the cold metal burning my bare hands, and pulled the gate open. It shrieked in protest, its hinges frozen with rust and disuse. I had opened it just wide enough to slip through. I was in. I dragged my gear through the gap and stood for a moment, looking up the driveway. It was more of a path now, 2 ruts in the earth, overgrown with weeds and saplings. It curved up a small hill and disappeared into the trees. I couldn't see the hut yet. The walk up the driveway was an act of faith. The path was steep and my lungs burned. But then, as I crested the small hill, I saw it. And it was just as I remembered, only more so. More real, more dilapidated, more imposing. The Quonset hut. It was a perfect, enormous half-cylinder of corrugated metal, sitting in the middle of a clearing. Its surface was a patchwork of silver and rust, gleaming dully in the morning light. It looked like a downed spaceship, something alien and ancient that had fallen from the sky and been slowly reclaimed by the forest. It was bigger than I remembered, at least 100 feet long and maybe 40 feet wide at its base. The front was a massive sliding door, also rusted, with a smaller, man-sized door cut into it. I tried the handle on the small door. Locked, of course. I walked the perimeter. The metal was cold to the touch. Weeds grew thick and high along its base. Around back there was nothing, just the curved wall of metal meeting the concrete slab foundation. No windows, no other doors. It was a fortress, just as Grandpa had said. A fortress designed to keep the world out. I went back to the front. The main sliding door was a beast, probably weighing a ton. It ran on a track at the top. I found a spot where the bottom edge had been bent, leaving a gap of about 2 feet between the door and the concrete. It looked like someone had tried to pry it open with a truck and failed. But the gap was big enough. I got on my hands and knees, pushed my gear under first, and then wriggled my way through the opening. I scraped my back on the jagged metal, but I was in. I stood up and my breath caught in my throat. The space was cavernous, absolutely immense. The curved ceiling soared 30 feet above me. Light filtered in through a few grimy plastic skylights in the roof, illuminating a vast, dusty emptiness. The air inside was still and colder, if possible, than the air outside. It was the deep, penetrating cold of a tomb. The concrete floor seemed to suck the warmth right out of the soles of my boots. My voice, when I spoke, was a small, swallowed sound. "Hello?" The echo came back, thin and ghostly. "Hello. Hello. Low." The place smelled of rust, damp concrete, and mice. In the center of the vast space, there was nothing, just a dusty floor. Along one wall were a few rotting wooden pallets. Against the other wall was a long, heavy workbench, littered with old, rusted tools, wrenches, hammers, saw blades. A thick layer of dust and cobwebs covered everything. It was a cathedral of neglect. At the far end of the hut, a small section had been framed in with wooden 2x4s and plywood, creating a room within the larger structure. This must have been the living space he'd planned. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing unnervingly. The door to the room was a simple piece of plywood on hinges. I pushed it open. Inside was a small, grim chamber. A metal cot with a thin, moldy mattress, a small table and a single chair, and in the corner, a small, pot-bellied wood stove, its stovepipe running up through the plywood ceiling. Hope surged in me, bright and hot, and then died just as quickly. I looked closer. The stove was a wreck. A huge crack ran down its side, and the cast iron around the door was rusted completely through. It was useless and dangerous. Trying to light a fire in it would be suicide. My shoulders slumped. The one hope for heat was gone. The 0-degree sleeping bag suddenly felt like a cruel joke. There was no way I could survive a winter in here. The cold would just seep through the metal walls and kill me in my sleep. It was over. The whole desperate plan was a failure. I had traded a warm cage for a magnificent freezing tomb. I sat down on the edge of the cot, the springs groaning in protest, and put my head in my hands. The silence of the place pressed in on me, the sheer, indifferent emptiness of it all. I sat there for a long time, a black tide of despair washing over me. I thought about the bus station. I could walk the 3 miles back. I still had money. I could buy a ticket, go somewhere, anywhere. But where? Back to the city? Back to Ms. Albright, to admit defeat and beg for a spot in the smiling, soulless group home. The thought filled me with a fresh wave of shame. After a while, the cold forced me to move. I couldn't just sit there. I stood up and started pacing, trying to generate some body heat. I ran my hands over the cold, corrugated metal walls. I walked back out into the main part of the hut, my eyes scanning the shadows, looking for anything. A miracle. My gaze fell on the workbench again. I started picking through the tools, not knowing what I was looking for. A heavy ball-peen hammer, a set of massive wrenches, too big for any normal nut or bolt. And under a pile of greasy rags, I found a book. It was a farmer's almanac, its cover faded and water-stained. It was from 10 years ago. I flipped through the pages idly. Planting schedules, weather predictions, homespun advice. As I turned a page, a folded piece of paper fell out. It wasn't a letter. It was a drawing, done in my grandpa's familiar blocky handwriting. It was a cross-section of the Quonset hut. He'd drawn arrows pointing to the curved walls, and next to the arrows, he'd written, "Straw insulation, 3 feet deep minimum for deep winter." Below that, another note. R value of straw bale, approximately. R 2.5 per inch. 36 inches equals R 90. Better than a damn house. I stared at the drawing. Straw insulation. I remembered him talking about it now, a long-forgotten conversation from a summer afternoon. He'd been pointing at the hut, a wild look in his eye. People think metal is cold, Leo, but it's just a shell. The pioneers didn't have fiberglass. They had mud, they had sod, they had straw. The earth provides, if you know how to ask. An idea, insane and audacious, began to form in my mind. A wall of straw, a room made of straw inside the hut. A nest. I looked around the vast, empty space. It would take a mountain of straw, hundreds of bales. It would cost a fortune. It was a crazy, impossible plan. And it was the first spark of real hope I'd had. But there was still the matter of the small, grim room. Something felt unfinished there. Next to the broken stove was a heavy, military-style footlocker, painted olive drab. It was locked with a thick brass padlock. I shook it. Something inside shifted with a dull, heavy thud. My heart started beating faster. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the answer. I searched the workbench, the shelves, the floor. No key. Of course not. Nothing was going to be that easy. Frustration gave way to determination. I went back to the workbench and picked up the heaviest tool I could find, a long steel crowbar. I returned to the room and wedged the tip of the crowbar into the hasp of the footlocker. I put all my weight on it. The metal groaned. I repositioned it and tried again, my muscles straining. With a sudden, violent crack, the hasp ripped free from the wooden lid. I threw the crowbar aside and knelt, my hands trembling slightly. I lifted the heavy lid. The contents were not what I expected. No treasure, no weapons, no survival gear. It was filled with paper, stacks of it, manila folders, bound with rubber bands. I lifted one out. It was a thick sheaf of legal documents, property deeds, trust agreements, bank statements. It was the secret history of this place. And lying on top of all the folders was a single, thick, cream-colored envelope. My name was written on the front in my grandpa's unmistakable hand. Leo, just my name. I lifted it out. The envelope was heavy, sealed with a blob of red wax. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold it. This was it, the final word, the explanation or the final cruel joke. For 2 years I had imagined this moment, imagined what he might say. I had prepared myself for excuses, for apologies, for anger. I was not prepared for what I was about to read. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold wall, and carefully broke the wax seal. I pulled out a thick wad of folded pages, covered in that familiar, slightly slanted script. I took a deep, shuddering breath and began to read. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then a few things have happened. First, you remembered this place. Second, you were brave enough, or foolish enough, to come here. And third, I am gone. I don't mean gone on a trip. I mean gone for good. And for that, for the way I left, I am more sorry than these words can ever say. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. I know you feel abandoned. You were. But I need you to understand that I did not abandon you because I stopped loving you. I abandoned you because I loved you too much to let you be destroyed with me. About a month before I left, I got a diagnosis from a doctor. A nasty one. It's a disease that takes your mind before it takes your body. The doctors gave me a year, maybe 2, before I wouldn't be myself anymore. Before I wouldn't know my own name, let alone be able to take care of my grandson. The thought of you watching me fade away, of you having to become the caregiver, I couldn't do it, Leo. I couldn't put you through that. But that's only half the story. The uglier half has to do with mistakes I made a long time ago, before you were even born. When your grandmother was sick, the medical bills piled up higher than a mountain. I was proud and stupid. I borrowed money from the wrong people, not banks, men who don't have legally binding contracts, just threats. I paid them back, or so I thought, but they were the kind of people who never let you truly get free. They came back. They said I still owed them, with a decade of interest that was more than the value of our house, this land, everything. They threatened me, and then they threatened you. They showed me a picture of you walking home from school, and they told me that if I couldn't pay, they would take their payment out of your future. I looked at their faces, and I knew they meant it. I was trapped. If I stayed, my mind would go, and they would come for you. If I fought them, they would hurt you to get to me. I had only one card left to play. A terrible, desperate card. I had to make you disappear from me. I had to sever our legal connection so they couldn't use you as leverage. By walking away and letting the state take you, I made you a ward of the court. You became a ghost. Your name went into a system they couldn't easily access. You were protected by the very bureaucracy I always hated. It was the only way I could think of to build a wall around you that they couldn't break through. I sold the house in the city. I used most of the money to set up a trust for this property. It's complicated, tied up in legal knots that would take a team of lawyers years to unravel. It's designed to be untouchable until your 18th birthday. On that day, it becomes yours, clean and clear. I hoped that by then enough time would have passed, that I would be long gone and the sharks would have moved on to other waters. Leaving you that day was the hardest thing I have ever done. It felt like cutting off my own arm. Every instinct screamed at me to stay, to hold you, to explain. But I couldn't. For the plan to work, it had to look real. You had to believe it. The state had to believe it. And I am so sorry for the pain that belief has caused you. I came out here, to our fortress. I spent my last few months of clarity getting things in order, writing this letter. There's some cash hidden here. It's not a lot, but it was all I had left after setting up the trust. It should be enough to help you get started. Look inside the third support beam from the back wall, the one on the west side. There's a loose panel 4 feet up. It's behind there. Now you have a choice, son. This land is your inheritance. When you turn 18, you can sell it. The developers have been trying to buy up this whole valley for years. It's worth a lot of money. Enough to start a new life anywhere you want, far away from all this. No one would blame you if you took the money and ran. God knows you've earned an easy path. Or you can stay. You can make this place a home. It's good land. It's quiet. It's safe now. I always dreamed of us building a real life out here, off the grid, beholden to no one. I won't get to see that dream come true, but maybe you can. Whatever you choose, know this. Not a day has gone by, not even in the fog that is now my mind, that I haven't thought of you. Know that I am proud of the man you are becoming. Know that you were and are the best part of my life. Survive, Leo. That's all I ask. Survive, and then live. Live for both of us. Your loving grandpa, Ken. The letter fell from my hands. The pages fluttered to the dusty concrete floor. I couldn't breathe. A sound came out of my throat, a ragged, strangled noise I didn't recognize as my own. The story I had told myself for 2 years, the story of being unwanted, of being a burden, of being thrown away. It was a lie, a fiction I had built to protect myself from a pain I couldn't understand. The truth was 1,000 times more painful, and 1,000 times more beautiful. He didn't leave me. He saved me. The anger I had nurtured for 2 years, my shield, my armor, shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. And underneath it was a grief so profound it felt like a physical chasm opening up inside my chest. I curled into a ball on the cold floor of that empty, forgotten hut, and I cried. I cried for the little boy who thought his hero had abandoned him. I cried for the old man who had to sacrifice his last days with the person he loved most. I cried for the years we had lost, for the conversations we would never have. The sobs racked my body, tearing through me until I was empty and exhausted, leaving nothing but a hollow ache and the cold, hard truth. He had built a wall around me with lawyers and paperwork. He had faced down monsters, both in his mind and in the world, to keep me safe. And his last command, his last wish, was for me to survive. I lay there for what felt like hours, the cold of the concrete seeping into my bones. But it was a different kind of cold now. It wasn't the cold of despair. It was just cold. A physical problem with a physical solution. Slowly, I sat up. I gathered the pages of the letter, folded them carefully, and placed them back in the envelope. I looked around the small, grim room. I looked at the broken stove, the moldy mattress. Then my eyes fell on the drawing from the almanac, still clutched in my other hand. Straw insulation, 3 feet deep minimum. My grandpa hadn't just left me a choice between selling and staying. He had left me a blueprint. He had left me a challenge. Survive. I stood up, my legs stiff. I walked out into the main part of the hut, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. I went to the west wall, counted 3 support beams from the back. 4 feet up, just as he'd said, there was a small metal panel that looked just like all the others. But when I pushed on it, it moved. I pried it open with my fingertips. Inside the hollow steel beam was a canvas bag. I reached in and pulled it out. It was heavy. I untied the drawstring and poured the contents onto the workbench. It was cash. Wads of 20s and 50s, bound with rubber bands. I counted it quickly, my hands still shaking. It was just over $5,000. $5,000. It was a fortune. It was a lifeline. It was enough. I stared at the money, then at the drawing, then around the enormous, freezing metal shell. A plan, no longer insane but necessary, clicked into place in my mind. I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to just survive here. I was going to build a fortress, just like he did. But mine wouldn't be made of legal documents and lies. Mine would be made of straw. Have you ever had a moment where everything you thought was true turned out to be a lie, but a lie told to protect you? It breaks you and rebuilds you all at once. It's a pain that's also a gift. If you know what that feels like, if you've ever had to unlearn your own story to find the truth, let me know in the comments. You're not alone in that feeling. It's a lonely club, but we're in it together. Now, let's get back to it. I had a mountain to build. The first step was a walk back to the crossroads. The 3 miles felt different this time. I wasn't running from anything anymore. I was walking towards something. The air was still bitingly cold, but my blood was up. I had a purpose. My grief was a fire in my belly, and the work ahead was the only thing that could keep it from consuming me. The man at the gas station convenience store looked up from his newspaper as I walked in. He was a lanky guy with a kind, tired face. "Cold enough for you?" he asked, the standard local greeting. "Getting there," I said. "Is there a feed store around here? A place that sells hay or straw?" He looked me over, my thin jacket and my determined expression. "Sure is. Miller's Feed and Seed, about 5 miles down the highway heading north. Can't miss it. Big red barn. But you ain't got a truck." It wasn't a question. "Do they deliver?" "Old man Miller will deliver anything if the cash is green," he said with a chuckle. "What do you need straw for?" I thought of a dozen lies. Insulating a pump house, bedding for animals I didn't have. But I was tired of lies. "Insulating a building," I said simply. He nodded slowly, his curiosity piqued, but his politeness winning out. He didn't press. Instead, he pointed to a greasy phone book chained to the wall. "Their number's in there. Or you could try hitching. Someone's bound to be heading that way." I decided to walk. I needed the time to think, to calculate. How much was 400 bales of straw? How much would delivery cost? How would I even explain the order? I bought a bottle of water and a bag of peanuts, the first things I'd eaten all day, and started up the highway. The walk was long. Cars and logging trucks roared past, blasting me with wind and road grime. But I barely noticed. My mind was in the Quonset, picturing the walls. I paced it out in my head, 100 feet long, 40 feet wide. To build a 3-foot-thick wall along both long sides and the back would take a lot. My initial guess of 400 bales suddenly felt terrifyingly small. When I finally saw the big red barn of Miller's Feed and Seed, it was a welcome sight. I pushed open the heavy door and was hit by a warm, earthy smell of grain, fertilizer, and sweet hay. An old man with a face like a dried apple and hands like gnarled oak roots sat on a stool behind the counter. This had to be Old Man Miller. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I took a breath. "I need to buy some straw bales." "All right. How many?" "I think 400, I said, trying to make it sound like a normal request. He stopped chewing on the piece of straw in his mouth and looked at me. Really looked at me for the first time. His eyes were a sharp, clear blue. They didn't miss much. He looked at my worn clothes, my city-soft hands, my too young face. He didn't say, "What's a kid like you need 400 bales for?" He just asked, "Square or round?" "Square," I said. "Standard 2-string bales." He did a quick calculation in his head. "Got a load coming in tomorrow. Can have them for you. It'll be $5 a bale, plus delivery." $2,000. My heart clenched. It was a huge chunk of the money, but the drawing said 3 feet deep, R90. This was not the place to cut corners. "And delivery?" I asked. "Where to?" "Down Hemlock Lane. There's an old Quonset hut on the Henderson place." A flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Kenny Henderson's place. Haven't been down that road in years. Thought that place was empty." "It is," I said. "I'm getting it ready." He chewed on that for a minute, his gaze unwavering. He was putting pieces together. A kid, a pile of cash, and abandoned property. He could have called the sheriff. He could have told me to get lost. He could have asked 100 questions I didn't have answers for. He did none of those things. He just nodded, as if my vague explanation was all the reason he needed. "Delivery will be another 100. Big truck, long driveway. I'll need the money in cash, up front." "I have it," I said, my hand instinctively going to the pocket where the money was. "All right then," he said, turning to a dusty ledger. "I can have my boy run them out there tomorrow afternoon. He'll help you unload them, stack them by the door. After that, you're on your own. 400 bales is a hell of a lot of work for one person." "I know," I said. "I'm ready." He looked at me again, a long, searching look. Then he gave a short, sharp nod. "Some people are." I counted out $2,100 in cash on his dusty counter. He didn't even bother to recount it. He just scooped it into a metal cash box. "See you tomorrow, kid," was all he said. The next afternoon, a massive flatbed truck, groaning under the weight of a mountain of golden straw, rumbled up the driveway. A young man my age, but built like a bull, jumped out of the cab. This must be Miller's boy. He looked at the hut, at me, and just shook his head with a slight grin. "Dad said you were ambitious." For the next 2 hours, we worked in a steady, silent rhythm. He would drive the forklift on the truck to the edge, and I would guide the bales as he dropped them, 10 at a time. Then we'd stack them in a massive, neat pile just outside the hut's door. The pile grew to an absurd size, a block of solid straw bigger than a small house. When we were done, he wiped the sweat from his brow, even in the cold. "That's all of them," he said. "Good luck, man, whatever it is you're doing." He got back in his truck, gave a short wave, and rumbled away, leaving me alone with my mountain. I stood there, staring at the task ahead. It was monumental. Each bale weighed about 50 pounds, 400 of them. 20,000 pounds of straw to be moved and stacked by me alone. I didn't wait. I didn't let the doubt creep in. I just started. I dragged the first bale through the gap under the door. The inside of the hut swallowed it. It looked tiny, pathetic. I dragged another, and another. Then I started stacking. I followed the curve of the wall, laying the first course. The work was brutal. The bales were awkward, heavy. The straw dust got in my eyes, my nose, my throat. My hands, even with gloves, were quickly rubbed raw. My back screamed in protest. I worked until the sun went down, stopping only to drink water and eat a handful of nuts. By the end of the first day, I had a single layer of bales running the length of one wall. It was a pathetic amount of progress. I was exhausted, every muscle trembling. I crawled into my sleeping bag, not even in a nest of straw yet, just on the cold concrete, and fell into a dead, dreamless sleep. The next day, I started again at dawn, and the next. It became my entire world. Wake up, drag bales, stack bales, eat, sleep, repeat. The hut transformed slowly, agonizingly. The cold, echoing metal cavern began to shrink. The wall of straw grew, a thick, golden barrier against the outside world. I created a space in the middle, about 15 by 20 feet, my living area. The rest of the hut was dedicated to insulation. I stacked the bales 3 deep and as high as I could reach, about 10 feet. I staggered them like bricks, packing them tight. The air in my little clearing began to change. The echo was gone, replaced by a soft, muffled silence. The temperature, while still cold, lost its sharp, metallic edge. The straw was working. It was absorbing the cold, holding the tiny bit of heat my body produced. After a week of non-stop labor, the main walls were done. I had built my fortress. I still had about 50 bales left. I used these to build the final piece, my nest. In one corner of my living space, I built a smaller 3-sided box of straw, and then I laid bales over the top to create a roof. I left an opening just big enough to crawl through. Inside this tiny cave, I threw my sleeping bag and my tarp. It was a room within a room within a room. A straw tomb that I hoped would be my salvation. When I was finally done, I stood in the middle of my new home, covered in dust, my body a single, unified ache. The Quonset hut was no longer a vast, empty space. It was a snug, quiet, hay-smelling den. I had moved a mountain. I had done the impossible. And as I crawled into my straw nest for the first time, pulling a loose bale in to block the entrance, I felt a sense of security I hadn't felt in years. The wind could howl now. The temperature could drop. I was ready. The first real test came a week later. I woke up one morning to a different kind of silence. A deep, profound hush had fallen over the world. I crawled out of my nest. The air in my living space was cold, my breath pluming in front of me. I cooked my breakfast, a packet of oatmeal and a cup of instant coffee on my little propane stove, and then I unblocked the entrance to my nest and peeked outside the small door of the hut. The world was gone. It had been replaced by a swirling, howling vortex of white. The snow wasn't falling, it was moving sideways, driven by a wind that shrieked and moaned around the metal shell of the hut. A full-blown blizzard. I could barely see the tree line, a faint, ghostly suggestion in the chaos. A thrill of fear and excitement shot through me. This was it. I quickly retreated inside, the wind tearing the door from my hand and slamming it shut. The sound of the storm outside was terrifying. It was a physical assault. The wind hit the metal walls like a battering ram, and the whole structure groaned and vibrated. But inside my straw-lined clearing, the sound was muffled, distant. It was like listening to a storm from the bottom of the ocean. The temperature dropped all day. I had a small, cheap thermometer, and I watched the red line fall. 20 degrees. 10. 0. By nightfall, it was 10 below. The metal walls of the hut, where they were exposed near the roof, were coated in a thick layer of frost. The air in the main part of the hut was arctic, but in my little 15 by 20 clearing, it was noticeably less brutal. I could still see my breath, but the air didn't hurt to breathe. It was probably around freezing, a 30-degree difference. The real magic happened when I crawled into my nest. Inside the tiny 6 by 4 foot cave of straw, with the entrance blocked, the air was still. I got into my sleeping bag. Slowly, minute by minute, the heat from my own body began to fill the tiny space. It had nowhere to go. The straw, feet thick in every direction, held it. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the blizzard rage outside. It was a wild, primal sound. But inside my tiny burrow, I was warm. Not just not freezing, but genuinely, comfortably warm. I had created a pocket of life in the heart of the killing cold. I thought of my grandpa. I thought of his letter. Survive. I was doing it. A single, hot tear traced a path through the dust on my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of triumph. The storm lasted for 3 days. I didn't leave the hut. I had my food, my water. I had filled several large containers before the storm, and my sanctuary. I spent the time organizing my small space, reading the old almanac, and mostly just thinking. The loneliness was profound. The silence between gusts of wind was absolute. But it wasn't the frantic, scared loneliness of the city. This was a calm, meditative solitude. I was alone, but I wasn't lost. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. When the storm finally broke, the world was transformed. I pushed open the door to a landscape of impossible beauty and harshness. The snow was waist-deep, a perfect, glittering blanket under a brilliant blue sky. The air was so cold it felt crystalline, sharp. My thermometer read 22 degrees below zero. Life settled into a routine dictated by the cold. My days were about survival, pure and simple. I would spend a few hours each day outside, gathering wood from fallen trees for a small, inefficient fire I'd build in a metal drum, for a bit of cheer, and a way to melt snow for water more efficiently than the propane stove. The work was hard. The snow was deep, and the cold was relentless. My gear, my surplus stored treasures, was barely adequate. My boots were never quite dry. My gloves were never quite warm enough. But they were enough. The coldest night came in late January. A clear, still, star-filled night. The kind of beautiful, silent night that can kill you. I woke up in the middle of the night, needing to use the outhouse I'd dug. I crawled out of my nest, and the cold in the main clearing was shocking. It felt like walking into a solid wall. My breath didn't just plume, it crackled. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it on the thermometer. The red line was at the very bottom, minus 38 degrees. A primal fear shot through me. This was not survivable cold. This was alien planet cold. The kind of cold that freezes engines and shatters steel. I did what I had to do as fast as I could and scrambled back to my nest, my whole body shaking, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. I burrowed deep into my sleeping bag inside my straw cave, pulling the opening shut tight. Even inside, the cold was a palpable presence. It took almost an hour for my shivering to stop. I lay there, listening to the strange creaks and groans of the metal hut contracting in the extreme cold, and I prayed. I prayed to my grandpa, to whatever was out there in the vast, cold, starry night. And I survived. When the sun came up, the thermometer had crept back up to a balmy minus 20. I had made it through the worst of it. I had looked into the heart of the winter, and it had not broken me. One afternoon in February, I heard a sound I hadn't heard in months. An engine. I peered out the door and saw a snowmobile making its way slowly up my unplowed driveway. My heart leaped into my throat. The police? Social services? Had they found me? The snowmobile stopped 100 yards from the hut. The driver was a figure bundled up beyond recognition. It was Old Man Miller. He didn't get off. He just sat there on his machine, idling, and looked at the hut. He saw the wisp of smoke from my stovepipe. He saw my tracks in the snow. He raised a gloved hand in a slow, deliberate wave. I was hidden behind the door, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. After a moment of hesitation, I stepped out and raised my own hand in return. He nodded, a single sharp dip of his head. Then he turned his snowmobile around and headed back down the driveway, leaving a clean track in the snow. He hadn't come to rescue me or to turn me in. He had come to check, to make sure the crazy kid who bought 400 bales of straw was still alive. In that small, silent exchange, a whole conversation had taken place. "You still there?" "I'm still here." "All right, then." It was the most profound human contact I had had in months. I was not entirely alone. Someone knew I was here, and someone, in their own quiet, gruff way, cared enough to check. The winter did not end gracefully. It fought, clinging on with late-season storms and bitter cold snaps well into April. But slowly, inevitably, it began to lose its grip. The days grew longer. The sunlight, filtering through the skylights, had a new warmth to it. I heard the first drips of melting snow from the roof. It was the sweetest sound in the world. I began to spend more time outside, exploring the land as it emerged from its white tomb. I walked the perimeter of the property, a full 40 acres of woods and fallow fields. I found the creek that my grandpa had marked on his map. I saw deer tracks, and one day, the massive paw print of a bear freshly emerged from its den. The world was coming back to life, and I felt like I was too. I had survived. I had made it through the belly of the beast. The scrawny, scared kid who had stumbled off that bus 6 months ago was gone. In his place was someone else, someone leaner, harder, with calluses on his hands and a quiet confidence in his eyes. I had been tested by the cold, the solitude, the fear, and I hadn't broken. I took out my grandpa's letter one sunny afternoon and read it again. The words hit me differently now. They weren't just a story about the past. They were a blueprint for the future. You can sell it, or you can stay. I looked around at the clearing, at the hulking, rusted Quonset hut that had been my salvation, at the mountain of straw, now damp and smelling of spring. I looked at the woods, the buds on the trees like tiny clenched fists waiting to open. Selling this place felt like a betrayal. It would be like selling a part of myself, a part of him. This land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was a story. It was a sacrifice. It was a second chance. The money from the sale would be an easy path, just as he'd said. A new apartment, a new town, a life where I didn't have to melt snow for water. But the easy path wasn't my path anymore. I had spent a winter learning the value of the hard way. I had learned that strength isn't something you're given. It's something you build, one bale, one frozen night at a time. I made my choice. I was staying. This was home. Not the hut, not the land, but the promise it represented. The promise of building something real, something that was mine, on a foundation of love and sacrifice that I finally understood. The work was just beginning. I had to learn how to farm, how to fix things, how to live in this place for real, not just survive. I had to wait 2 more years until my 18th birthday, when the land would legally be mine. But I wasn't scared anymore. I had time, and I had a purpose. I was here to honor the man who gave me this chance, and to build the life he never got to have. Home isn't always 4 walls and a roof. Sometimes it's a promise. Sometimes it's a truth you have to dig for through years of anger and pain. Sometimes it's a pile of straw that gets you through the coldest night of your life, a flimsy, organic shield against a world that wants you to freeze. What I learned in that Quonset hut was that the stories we tell ourselves about being abandoned are powerful. They can become our own prisons. But the truth is often more complicated and filled with a love we couldn't see at the time. My grandfather didn't leave me alone. He left me a challenge. He left me a chance to become the man he knew I could be. He gave me the gift of the hard way. In the years that followed, I stayed. I turned 18 and signed the papers that made his sacrifice real. The land was mine. I cleaned out the hut, but I left a small section of the straw wall up as a reminder. I learned how to fix that old wood stove. I cleared the fields. I met neighbors, including Old Man Miller, who eventually told me he knew my grandpa and that he was a good, stubborn man. He said he saw the same stubbornness in me. I took it as the highest compliment. The hut is still here, but it's not my only shelter anymore. There's a small cabin now, one I built with my own hands, on a hill overlooking the creek. It has windows and a real bed. It's warm. It's a home. If this story meant something to you, if it stirred something in your own past, please hit that subscribe button. This channel is a place for stories like this, for people who have walked the hard path. And I want you to share your story in the comments below. What was the Quonset hut in your life? What challenge did you have to overcome to find out who you really are? I read every one, because in these stories we find each other. We find that our private struggles are part of a shared human experience. And we learn that we're not as alone as we think we are, even on the coldest night.